And I think that is the little superpower that introverts have, because when extroverts are working a room, they're focused on those superficial conversations, the small talk, how's your family, how was your day? And so they can connect with more people, but on a shallower level. Whereas an introvert, if they're willing, if they're not afraid and they're willing to ask those deep questions, then they get into the deep conversations and they actually build a deeper connection.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Pivot Talk with me, Alex. In today's episode, I am joined by award-winning international speaker, host of Juggling Without Balls podcast, author of the book Overcoming Awkward, The Introvert's Guide to Networking, Marketing, and Sales, a licensed mortgage broker, and a speaking coach. My guest today has many insights into how introverts can up their networking game, in addition to learning to pitch for success. With that said, I feel privileged to have the opportunity to sit down and chat about all of these things with Monica Parkin. Monica, welcome to the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Alex. I'm really excited to have a conversation about this topic.
Yeah, and I'm so excited to be able to allow the students at King's College London and a lot of the members at King's Business Club to be able to learn about all of the things surrounding introversion, networking, and a lot of the things that are included in your book, Overcoming Awkward. So let's start by asking you, what exactly prompted you to write this book, Overcoming Awkward?
Yeah, it definitely came from personal experience. I'm very much an introvert. When I first started out to be a mortgage broker, sorry, I can hear my cat in the background. When I first started out to be a mortgage broker, though, I had this idea that it was going to be this job that I could just work from home, send some emails, make some phone calls. Like, I didn't think I would actually have to put myself out there. I thought it was just solving problems and dealing with numbers. And what I found out is, 25% of the job is solving problems and dealing with numbers. And the other 75% is actually going out there, networking, building relationships, building a client base, bringing those clients in. And so when I found that out, like, I just about quit. I kind of had this moment of panic where I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And that's when I really had to start working on this myself. And we could talk about that if you want, but I had to go to a networking event, and that was a really, really scary thing for me.
Yeah. So let's talk about that then. In your book, you talk about that very networking event that you attended, and you said you found it incredibly scary. And why don't you tell us a little bit about how that went and your experience?
So I had a very sleepless night the night before, and then my colleagues said, we're going to be there, don't worry, there'll be people to hang out with, whatever. So I got there, and no one was there yet. Walked in, looked around, saw all these people, didn't know where to stand, where to talk, like how to talk, how long am I supposed to make eye contact for, like how long do you hang out at the hors d'oeuvre table, how long for, like, I just got overwhelmed, and I literally turned around and went out to my car and just sat there and played on my phone and thought, like, I don't know if I can do this. Maybe I tell them I'm sick today. Maybe I go home. Like, what do I do? And of course, just as I'm getting ready to make excuses, my colleague shows up and she's like, "Oh, great, you're here. Let's go inside." And so I had to go in and I had to do that, but it was really uncomfortable. It was really painful. I felt completely out of place. Basically, I just put on this artificial front. I walked around, I shook hands. I told people my name. I got the lowest rate, blah, blah, blah. I did all the things I thought you were supposed to do, sold my product, sold myself, talked about me, come home at the end of the night. And I got this handful of cards, and I'm looking at them thinking, like, what am I going to do with these? Like, I don't know these people. I didn't make a connection with them. I didn't build a friendship with them. And I tossed those cards in the garbage. And as I did that, this light bulb went on my head, and I'm like, I'm throwing out their cards. Like, that means they're throwing out my cards too. That means, like, I just spent 2 hours being terrified, being uncomfortable, and nothing came of that. Like, no leads, no relationships, nothing. And that's when I realized, like, there has to be a better way for people like me to build relationships and to get clients than doing what I just did.
Yeah. And obviously what your experiences stemmed from an introverted personality, I imagine. So you were an introvert then.
Absolutely an introvert. Yeah, a very
Yeah.
socially awkward introvert. Up until I started that career, really, I was the person who almost never left my house. Even when I took my kids to school, I'd drop them off at the curb so I didn't have to talk to the other moms. I'd be the person who wouldn't talk to the clerk in the grocery store. I really very much lived within my own little bubble, and I didn't want to step outside of that bubble. It was really uncomfortable for me to do so.
Yeah. And just for a moment, I'd like to dwell on the idea of introversion. I talk about it a lot recently because I'm reading about it. I'm currently reading a book by Susan Cain called Quiet. It talks a lot about introversion. And prior to reading that, I always thought introverted people almost were slightly inferior in society. They couldn't go to these networking events. They were the people who shamefully sat in their car while everybody else was networking. The people who wanted to be moved to the edge of a classroom to avoid being sort of looked at and at the center of attention. The person who would arrive at a lecture late, look in the window and just walk away because they wouldn't walk in. But reading that book, I'm starting to understand, and I'd love to hear your comment on this, but I'm starting to understand that introverts have just as good a place in society as extroverts. It's just understanding that introverts, they can be great leaders just as good as extroverts. But what is your comment on introversion? Do you
Yeah.
think there's a place for it?
Absolutely. In fact, I would now say it's my superpower. If someone asked me, and I know that's kind of a cliche word, but I wouldn't take that back now. I actually, if I had a choice, I'm happy to be who I am. But when we look at the research between introverts and extroverts, they both have their society, and organizations that have both do better than organizations that just have one or the other. And when we look at people that are highly successful, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Meryl Streep, people like that, they're all introverts. And what they have in common is that they don't go out, they don't build relationships by being the loudest person in the room, by working a room. They do it with listening deeply, first of all, that skill set that introverts have. And it's not necessarily better or worse than extroverts, but it's a skill set, and it's this ability to really listen and really hear what the problem is. And when you can hear what the problem is, you can come up with a solution. And the other thing they do is, surprisingly, even though they don't love to work in groups, they actually do really well in teams because they have that willingness to listen to every member of the team, to collaborate, to really listen and find solutions. They're those deep thinkers. So they may not be the person out in the front, the voice of the organization, but and I can't remember, I think it was Bill Gates who said this actually, that his job is to think deeply, find solutions, and then pass it to an extrovert to execute, right? But they have this ability to really listen deeply, think deeply, and find solutions to problems. So there's a role for them.
Yeah. And obviously they do work really well together in teams. But the sad thing is, in a lot of teams, especially, I think there have been studies that were carried out, and a team would work together. It would be a mix of introverts and extroverts, but it wouldn't be defined who was introverted, extroverted. But it is defined sort of in an unwritten way. But they were filmed essentially. And what happened? They'd have this exercise, and there was a sort of a correct answer to this exercise. It was quite of a technical sort of problem-solving case. And the one of the most extroverted people in a lot of these teams, their answer was always accepted as the group favorite because they presented it so convincingly in such an extroverted way. But it was the introvert who had mentioned that a more convincing point multiple times, but nobody really took on to that because, is that really the right answer? I mean, he said that, and that was so much more convincing, or she said that. And yeah, I think that is sad. I mean, I don't want to sidetrack too much now, but what I would like to discuss is entrepreneurship. When I think of entrepreneurship, I think you mentioned a lot of business owners, a lot of CEOs like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, introverts. But in terms of entrepreneurship and really building a business and being at the heart of that, are introverts doomed then? Because for me now, I want to provide value to lots of people. In order to engage and speak to lots of people, I need to have some sort of confidence in speaking to lots of people, but I don't. So am I doomed then if I want to be an entrepreneur and provide value to lots of different people?
No, definitely not. Well, I mean, look at me, right? I started out as this person who could even walk in the door at an event, and I speak internationally now. I'm on TV. I lead teams. I do all these things, and I actually do it with a high degree of confidence. But that didn't happen overnight, right? So just like a world-class soccer player or football player, as you would say, there doesn't become that person overnight. If I only played a sport once a year, I'm not gonna get good at it. If I do it every day, a little bit at a time, I might not see that growth, but it will happen. It's like watching a plant grow, right? You don't see the leaves sprout. But all of a sudden you wake up one day and there it is. That's kind of how I feel, is that how I felt about my own transformation is all of a sudden, it happened so slowly that I didn't see those changes. But when I look back, by dipping my feet in a little bit at a time, a little bit every day, I kind of grew my confidence, and I took on bigger and bigger and bigger challenges. Like I didn't walk out the first day and go, I'm going to speak to a group of 3,000 people like I do now. I actually went to my first Toastmasters meeting, sat down and froze and didn't speak the whole meeting. But what I did do is I showed up again the next week, and then the next week, and the next week. And I had an open mind and a willingness to be open to the idea that change is possible.
Yeah. And I'd love to sort of get into the weeds of some of the different steps people can take from going from crippling anxiety to what you've done, speaking in front of, thousands of people at a time. But firstly, I'm really intrigued to know, just finishing on this idea of introversion, extroversion, are you able to go from one to the other, or are they fixed? Like, am I an introvert forever and I have to adapt to that? Or because the way you speak now, the way you speak about the events that you've spoken at, you present a more extroverted vibe to me. So can you go from introversion to extroversion, or are you always an introvert, but a better introvert?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I've actually asked myself from time to time. So at my core, I am still an introvert, right? If I had a choice between being here talking to you and sitting on the couch in my pajamas, I would choose sitting on the couch in my pajamas. But the reality is that once I get here, I actually really enjoy this connection. I enjoy this conversation, and I'm having a really good time. And the other part is that I've kind of learned it's like learning a new language, right? So I've had to, the more you do it, the more you immerse yourself. Like it really is like speaking another language. That's how I think of it in my head, like neurotypical or neurodivergent or introvert, extrovert, whatever you want to call it. When I only spoke introvert, that's the only thing I knew. And so I would walk into a group of extroverts and I just didn't know what to say. I just didn't know where I fit. But like if I'm a kid and I go to French immersion and I spend all day hanging around French people, listening to them speak, I start to pick up that language. And the more I pick it up, the more comfortable I get with it. So it's like extrovert is a second language for me now. At my core, I'm an introvert. That's what I choose to speak in my own home environment. But I can go anywhere and speak extrovert and feel very fluent with it. I'm not translating in my head. I can do it. It's just not my first choice.
So essentially you're an ambivert then, so a blend of the two.
That is the word someone used the other day, and I love that term actually, because I think that's what I've evolved in, is an omnivert. Like I said, I still enjoy my alone time. I still need time to recharge, but I also get a little bit of energy off of speaking now, whereas before that would exhaust me. And now when I go to a speaking event, you interact with the audience, I actually get a little buzz off of that. Like I really enjoy that energy from the crowd or the audience. Yeah.
And I love that you said that, because to try and combat some of my anxiety, and imposter syndrome is linked to this too, but my introversion and my lack of appetite to stand in front of a big group of people and present, unless it's absolutely my life depends on it. But I actually took one of these opportunities up voluntarily. I was offered to do it, and I did, and I went and spoke in front of, there weren't many people there, only about 30 people there. But I got myself so worked up. Like I have a friend who was incredibly extroverted, like we're almost like so far apart from each other in that sense. And I remember I was there, I was wearing like a suit. I was trying to look smart, and I was looking at my notes, and I was like there shaking. And he was sat across the table from me eating a steak and going, just chill. And I was like, it's like, that's it. Like he was looking forward to it. And I was like, I would do anything for somebody to come and punch me in the face so that I could not go in there right now, and it's crazy, that difference. But as you said, once I got there and I started speaking, I actually got some real some real energy from that as an extrovert would. And I think it's that maybe there's something else at play, with introverts. And I said it there, imposter syndrome, because that was the thing that held me back. It was limited beliefs in myself. So maybe I didn't believe that I could present myself, and this happens in networking events, right? You go to a networking event. Should I be there? Am I wasting somebody else's time? Like, am I just completely a unuseful asset to somebody? Do you know what I mean? Like, is that a play too? Maybe the imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Well, and what I found and what I figured out over time and what I found, at that first event, I wasn't being me, right? I wasn't being my authentic self. I was being who I thought everyone thought I should be, this business person, this mortgage broker, whatever. And the best advice I ever got from other people is just be you, be your authentic self. And the first time someone said that to me, I got so mad. I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, who says that to someone? I am me. But the reality is, when you're in that mindset where you're trying to be someone you're not, or you're trying to be who you think other people are, you're like a computer with all these different windows open. Like, you got all these programs running in the background. You're basically telling yourself a lie, and you're trying to remember all the details. I'm supposed to be this, I'm supposed to be. And it's very distracting, and it's hard to focus. It's hard to feel confident. It's hard to come across when you've got all these things going on in your mind. When I shut all that down and I stop trying to be who I'm not, who I think people think I should be, and I just be like quirky, weird me, like I'm a total nerd, and I just embrace my nerd, my inner nerd, my quirkiness, then I can just be me. And when I'm just me, then it's so easy to talk, because I don't have all these other windows open. I'm not thinking about how I should look or what I should say. I'm just being me. And when I'm just me, that comes across to the audience. They feel that authenticity. I don't have all these windows open. It's easy for me to speak because I'm literally just playing movie films from my head. I'm usually sharing stories about my life. I don't have to remember. I don't have to memorize something. I don't have to look at notes. I'm just going back into my memory banks and replaying something. And because it's my authentic, real experience, people feel that, they connect to it, and we build this emotional connection with each other. It's when I try to be someone I'm not, that's when I get nervous. That's when I get shaky. That's when I look weird. I feel weird. It's when I show up as me, whoever I am, like just this is me. That's when magic happens.
Yeah. I mean, I think anybody really, I think people quite enjoy when they're talking about things that they enjoy. And when other people show an interest in that, it gives them energy. And I think if I was in an exchange now, like me and you were talking about, introversion and stuff like that, and I like talking about this. So I think it's easy for you to see then that, I'm being genuine and that I'm engaged, and it's so easy to speak from, a state of authenticity, because it's so easy to just be yourself, because you just don't have to try and be anything else. It's hard to explain, but you just be you, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's a great point. When we're in a situation and we don't know what to say, because sometimes as introverts, at least for me, small talk is really difficult. Like I have a hard time with talking about the weather, stuck in an elevator with someone.
Yeah.
So a tip that I've learned for myself, and it's something that introverts are really good at, is we're really good at listening. So if you ask the right questions, you don't actually have to make small talk. If you ask questions of the person you're talking to that they're passionate about, that they're interested in, A, you get to find out a lot about them, and B, you get this vibe going. Even if it's not something you're totally interested in, you can start to feel their excitement about it, and you start to get into that. So instead of so when I go to an event now, instead of wow, look at the weather, I'll say, what inspired you to get into this business? What made you start this podcast? And that's when you get into these deep conversations. And when you get into deep conversations, you get into authentic conversations, and you get into authentic conversations. And that's where you build connections. And those connections are the kind of connections that will build your business, because those are the relationships you'll go back to again and again and again over time.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you said that. It's the first time somebody's mentioned something that I experienced but didn't know other people experienced, and it was that I know small talk is easier for some people. I hate it with a passion. I don't know how to do it. People think I'm being rude because I'm just like, they're like, oh, so how was your day? I'm like, good. I don't like to say, oh, how about you? I think it's quite awkward. I'd rather just go, so, what are your goals in life? That's a much more approachable way for me to speak. And I don't know why. I feel like I just skip the distance between me and somebody. Once I feel like I'm close to them, that's easier, right?
Yeah. And I think that is the little superpower that introverts have, because when extroverts are working a room, they're focused on those superficial
Mm,
conversations, the small talk, how's your family, how was your day? And so they can connect with more people, but on a shallower level. Whereas an introvert, if
right.
they're willing, if they're not afraid and they're willing to ask those deep questions, then they get into the deep conversations and they actually build a deeper connection faster. The other thing is, if you're willing to be just a little bit vulnerable, like I'm willing to share that I'm an introvert or whatever, or that I have a fear of this or that, it lets the other person be a bit vulnerable too, right? They put their guard down. They're
Yeah.
like, oh, you're willing to be a little bit vulnerable. You're totally safe. I'm going to share something I feel vulnerable about too. And then again, it just builds a deeper level of connection. I think that's a real
Mm,
strength of introverts if they're willing
yeah.
to embrace it.
Yeah. And that, the summary of that would be just quality over quantity, I guess. I mean, extroverts are
Yeah.
good at meeting lots of people and, speaking to lots of people. But I guess to your point, introverts are better at engaging less people, but on a deeper level and able to really connect with people. And that is a superpower. It's not one I thought of before. But I want to get into some more practical steps people can take. So let's say, for example, I hate networking events. I hate doing presentations. Let's stick with networking then for an example. I hate going to networking events. I've been to one or two, gives me crippling anxiety. I never go alone. I always go with someone else and I tag along with them the whole time and try and avoid eye contact. So like, let's say the most extreme end of anxiety in terms of these sorts of things. So is there like a few steps that people can follow? Like how would you lay this out for someone? How can they go from that person to who you have become?
Yeah, I would say I didn't do it by, well, at first time I did, but as I progressed, I didn't do it by jumping into a networking event. I did it by looking at what are some little tiny ways that I can dip my toes into social contact, and also by shifting my mindset, right? So I decided one day, like, because every day I would get up and I'm like, I freaking hate people. I hate talking to people. This is the worst. And the more I said that, the worse I felt about it, the more anxiety I had about it. So I thought, you know what if I shifted my mindset, right? What if I told myself a different story? What if I said, I like people. I love talking to people. Like, and it wasn't true. And it wasn't true the first day I did it, but I woke up in the morning and I said, okay, I'm going to tell myself that I like people. I'm going to go out and practice it. And at the end of the day, I'm going to notice if it worked for me or not. And I'm going to do this every day for a month. And at the end of the month, if it didn't work, so what? I didn't lose anything. If it did work, I can build on it. So the very first day, I like people. I'm going to have a great day. I'm going to talk to some people today. It's going to be awesome. I didn't believe it, but I pretended like I did. So I get to the grocery store and the clerk wants to ask me a question. And usually I would be like, head down, don't talk to me, don't make small talk, don't, like, I would actually get annoyed if they would talk to me. And I almost did that. And then I was like, no, you told yourself you like people today. You're
Yeah.
going to like people today. And so I responded to her. I'm like, oh, thanks very much. I'm having a great day. And then she said, do you know that item in your cart is on sale today? You can get another one for free. And I was like, no way. Are you serious? Like, it was an expensive item. So I went and got that item. I got a freebie. I came home, and at the end of the day, I did my little catalog. I looked for evidence, and I was like, I talked to the clerk. I got a free item. That worked out okay, right? And
Yeah.
then the next day, I'm at the mailbox and my neighbor drives up. And normally, if my neighbor drives up, I'm in my car and I leave because I don't want to talk to my neighbor. I don't want to have to feed their cat or whatever they're going to ask me to do or make small talk. And again, I was like, no, you said you liked people. You're going to pretend that you like people. And so, she says hello. I say hello back. Turns out she's a really nice person. She tells me, did you know that there's like a bear sleeping in your front yard every day? Like, you got to be careful when you leave in the morning, because I live in Canada in a rural area. And I was like, I had no idea. Like, that conversation could have saved my life.
Oh my
So at the end of the day, I'm like, wow, talking to people worked out again really
God.
well. And so every day I just notched it up a little more and a little more and a little more until I wasn't telling myself a lie anymore. I was actually getting up, looking forward to interacting with people. And then slowly over time, that bridged the gap to being able to go to
Yeah.
networking events. But, maybe it took me 8 or 9 months to comfortably walk into a networking event. But first I had to remove that fear component and replace that with this evidence for myself, because I'm a deep thinker. I need evidence for everything. So
Mm.
I had to go find the evidence and then go, yeah, you know what? You've been doing this for 9 months. Almost every interaction's had a good outcome. Almost everything's worked out. Nothing bad ever happens. No one bites your head off. Like, it's okay. And so it just made it's just like one little thing at a time. The analogy I use in the book is, I used to hate the taste of coffee, like it was awful. But after I had it every day for 2 weeks, it actually started to taste good and I started to crave it. That's how interacting with people worked for me. The first week I hated it. The second week it was getting a little better. By the third week I was like, you know what? I wonder who I'm going to meet today. Like this is actually getting kind of fun. But I had to do that shift a little at a time.
Yeah. And I have some comments on that, but I hate that this is what I picked out from that. But you said a bear sleeps in your drive every night. Like, is that real? Is that a real thing?
Yeah, no, real, like a black bear, a mother bear, and her cubs.
Gosh.
Just like 1 month of the year, I guess, when they're just coming out of hibernation and they're looking for stuff. And yeah, there's a bear that sleeps in my ditch like every morning. I had no idea. I just drove right past it. I didn't even see it. But yeah, I live on Vancouver Island in Canada in kind of a rural area in an acreage, and that's kind of a common thing here. So I didn't know.
Does that not scare you?
Well, I'm in my car. So, but now I actually look around when I come home, instead of just, walking around. I'm like, wonder if the bear's out today. Maybe I should be a little bit cautious.
If the bears are today. The worst we got to worry about in London right now are foxes, and they're not particularly aggressive. Because you guys have raccoons too, and they're quite aggressive, right?
Raccoons, mountain lions. Yeah. I mean, I've never actually seen a raccoon other than on the side of the road, but yeah, we've got some interesting creatures. Not as bad as Australia though. I hear everything in Australia will kill you. So I'm feeling pretty grateful for the limited wildlife we have.
Yeah. Well, that was interesting. Let's get back to the topic of the day. Yeah, that was interesting though. So let's start. I mentioned earlier about introverts and how maybe we need to, if we understand introversion, we can try and adapt the way we do things and adapt the way things are done for introverts. So do you think that the traditional networking event is setting introverts up for failure? Or do you think that they just need to become more omnivert or extrovert and adapt to the networking event itself? I mean, you said that's essentially what you did, right?
I did a bit of both. So I got to the point where I could go to networking events, but they are still not my first choice to build my business, right? I build my business one relationship at a time now. But what it did allow me to do is now when a client sits down across my desk from me to talk about their mortgage or whatever, instead of being kind of paralyzed with fear and just getting straight to business, I'll ask them about themselves. I'll get curious. I'll find out, and we'll start to have a conversation. We'll start to build a relationship, same with people like, lawyers or appraisers or all these people that are in my network that I rely on as referral partners. And then I also found other ways to network, like through social media or through different kinds of events. Like instead of just going to networking events, I'll go out and get involved in my community, right? I'll get involved with my kids' hockey team, or I'll sit on a committee at their school or whatever. And so that lets me work in a little group with people in a space that I'm comfortable with because it's 5 or 6 people. But over the course of a year, sitting on a committee with 5 people, you get to know them way deeper than you would get to know them at a networking event. They get to see your skills, they get to see your strengths. And those are the kinds of people that referrals will come back to me from more so than the people I meet at events. And that's what I tell people, like, find your passion, find what it is you're interested in, and go out and get involved and sit on those committees. Like, those committees are gold for networking. Like, when you sit down with someone for an hour every week, by the end of the year, like, they're a good friend. And as long as you're good at your job and you're not obnoxious and you're not a jerk, as long as you're, you're a good person and you're good at what you do, you're going to build relationships out of that. If you're not good at that, because I've seen this backfire for people, they volunteer for a committee where they have no skills or no time, where they don't show up or they don't do the work. And that actually decimates those relationships, right? People are like, I don't want anything to do with that person. But if you have something you're passionate about, get involved in your committee, in your community, sit on committees, do stuff where you can work in little groups with people and showcase your skills. And that's going to take you further than going to one event with 100 people 10 times a year. You're going to build your business faster in those little groups than you are in that big event.
Yeah. And there are a lot of our audience will be aspiring investment bankers, aspiring consultants. And how would you advise people then who are going the corporate route? They're going to have to deal with, high ticket clients. They're going to have to sound and look convincing. and they're going to have to present in front of a lot of people, go to networking events, go to these, drinks events, and it's almost like compulsory. So how would you advise somebody who's going into that area but feels like maybe they can't because they're too introverted, or they have too much anxiety to have to do things like that? Is there a way to overcome that, like in the short term, for people who are trying to get internships and maybe go in to be a graduate consultant?
Yeah, I would say one is, know that anything is possible, truly, and two, know that at least half the population is going through the same thing as you, right? So, in every group of graduates that's going in, at least half of those people are introverts. At least half those people are also anxious. When you show up at a networking event, at least half the other people there are feeling the same way you are. So, number one, you're not alone. Two, don't try to be someone you're not. Like if you show up at those events trying to be that perfect investment banker, whoever you think someone thinks you're supposed to be, that thing's going to happen where you got all those windows in the background, your mind's trying to cover up all these lies, you're going to fail, you're going to feel awkward, you're going to feel weird. Just show up as you. Ask good questions, like ask questions of other people. If you're not comfortable with small talk, find someone and ask them, what inspired you? Why are you in this business? What's the best piece of advice you could give me as a newcomer? Like people love to give new grads advice. And it's an amazing conversation starter. Like, hey, I'm a new grad. If you could go back in time and give yourself a piece of advice, what would you do? Like come up with a list of questions ahead of time. So you're not thinking on the spot, that you can ask people that they're going to be excited to answer, so that then when you're all of a sudden you've got to reach out and shake someone's hand, you have something in your head already that you can ask and you're not on the spot. And then in terms of speaking, it's practice, practice, practice. And we have Zoom now. So there's a million different Toastmaster groups, speaking groups on Zoom. You can join from anywhere in the world. Like my group meets in half an hour. We have people from London. We have people from all over the world. And we get online for an hour and we practice speaking in a safe environment where you get feedback, you get to practice. And then you can go out and apply that to real life. So if you're graduating in a year, or you're applying for a job in a year, start trying to build those speaking opportunities now, those little bits of practice. Because the more you do something, the more comfortable you get. And it's going to be, don't leave it until the day before your job starts to do that stuff.
Yeah. And a lot of the time there's a few different categories of people at a networking event, at a consultancy, for example, or an investment bank. There are going to be VPs, they're going to be managing directors, partners, that are going to be associates, analysts, interns. And you can have a category of different questions for each of those groups of people, like sort of, why did you want to join this firm, to an analyst or an associate? How was your experience so far, to like a third year associate? What have you learned from 10 years working here, to an MD or a VP, probably a managing director? There are, things you could prepare. That's the sort of thing you get into, I guess. I mean, I would go to a networking event, feel the room, and then see who I want to speak to, which is probably no one. But if I have a list of questions, if I'm approached, or not only that, like, I may be encouraged to go and speak to people because I've done all this work now. I might as well go and meet people and ask them the questions I've come up with.
Yeah, and you're prepared, and you feel less anxious when you're prepared, right? Yeah. If you don't know the answer, you're going to be terrified. If you have some, and the thing is, people love to talk. They love to talk about themselves. They love to be asked advice. And they love to talk about what they're passionate about. So if you can hit on one of those four things, they're going to actually be really excited to talk to you, and they're going to remember you, because you're not the person who talked about the weather. You're the person that actually asked some real questions about things they really want to talk about, and they're going to remember you because of that.
Yeah. And you briefly mentioned Zoom there. Yeah. And obviously last year, as a student, I spent every waking moment watching videos and on online tutorials. So I didn't even get to meet people in person. So what role do you think, maybe going forward now, that video and maybe social media will play in this whole sphere?
Yeah, for me, it's allowed me to grow my business globally, right? Before the pandemic, my speaking engagements, my relationships were limited to either email or people that I could meet in my community or where I could travel to. Now I can, I'm in Canada, I can come speak to you in London and we can have a conversation basically face to face. I mean, we're not face to face, but it's allowed me to grow my reach. It's allowed me to reach out and build relationships with people way beyond my community. And it also, if I want to practice something, like if I have a presentation that I'm going to do, I can go on Zoom, I can hit the record button, record myself doing it, play it back, watch it, go, I didn't love that, or that. I'm going to redo it. And the more times I do it, the more the nervousness goes away, the more confident, the more fluid it feels. It's like 10 steps up from practicing in front of a mirror, because you can play it back, pause, play it back, pause. By the time you actually have to do that presentation, you could have done it 100 times. And the reality is, half the time it might be on Zoom right now anyways. So it's going to feel just like it did.
Yeah. And I think those are some really good points. So I'd like to move on now and talk about the actual speaking, so the way you pitch yourself and your ideas. So is speaking success then linked to overcoming anxiety, or is it sort of a strategic approach to presenting and pitching in a more authentic way?
I think you nailed it with the second thing, because I've met people that are really, well, me, but people that are really anxious that are amazing speakers. And the speakers that are amazing are the ones that are authentic, they get vulnerable, and they trigger an emotion in someone, right? And they use stories to tell what they're talking about. So whenever I use a story or an example to tell you something, all of a sudden we're both playing the same scene in our head. We're both getting the same dump of serotonin. We're both getting the same chemicals in our brain. We're on the same wavelength. You can see it, you can feel it. Like if you think back to any event in your life that you remember vividly, it probably had an emotion connected with it. If we can make people feel an emotion when we're speaking through telling a story, through reliving an event, they're going to remember that, and they're going to be engaged. If we're just flipping through PowerPoint slides explaining something, like for me, say I'm talking about mortgage financing, right? I can talk all about credit rating and why it's important to have a good credit rating and your loan to value ratio. I can blah, blah, blah on about that for hours. But if I turn that into a story and I talk about this first time homebuyer who came to me and he makes like $100,000 a year, he has great income, but he has $1,000 a month car payment. And so instead of being able to afford a house for $600,000, he now can't afford a house at all, because he went out and got that car payment, which maxed out his credit. You're going to remember that story. You're going to go, I'm not getting a car payment before I get a house. You're going to remember that. If I just tell you it's important not to have payments and to keep your credit score good, you're not going to remember that. But if I tell it with a story and there's an emotional impact with that story and you can feel for this poor guy, then now it means something. And so that's what I try to do when I'm speaking, is I never just make a point. I make a point with a story, and the story has an emotional impact. And hopefully what you're going to do is you're going to take someone up on this emotional ride, build some tension, and then let it go, right? Let them release that tension by giving them the solution or the answer or whatever it is.
Yeah. And, and this applies whether you're an aspiring consultant, investment banker, entrepreneur. I've sat in lectures for 2 hours on corporate finance, and it's just been corporate finance, present value and all the jargon, and I've been practically falling asleep. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, there's obviously business case studies you can bring in, but it's difficult to bring interesting stories into that. But I think if they could really make a story to really engage me, it would be easier. And I think especially in finance, I mean, as you said, there are a lot of topics that they can be quite dry, and a lot of terms, a lot of information, just know this, bear this in mind. And I think, when I'm presented with a bit of context and a little bit of an anecdote, a story, it makes me, want to learn it, and it's easier to digest that way.
Yeah, the best teachers will weave a story into what they're doing. I remember one of the worst work presentations I ever went to. It was literally two guys reading a page out of the manual and taking turns. So one guy would read a page, and the next guy would read a page, and then the next guy, and the next guy. And they literally did this all day for 8 hours. And like, I just wanted to stab my eyeballs out at the end of the day. Like, I was so done. And then I saw that same presentation done a year later by someone else who gave us exactly the same information, but all along the way, she gave little examples. Like, they're talking about people not, when you're doing construction financing, why it's important not to go over this threshold, why it's important to have a 20% buffer. Well, that could be pretty boring, but then she gives the example of the person that did it and what the outcome was. and then moves on to the next point. But just putting those little examples, those little stories in there just allowed me to visualize, to see it, to apply it in my mind, and it keeps you engaged, right?
Yeah. And I see a lot of students doing this sometimes. Sometimes it's very much when we do a presentation, and I've done online presentations with groups in last year, especially because that was the only way we could be assessed. And a lot of the time you could almost tell they were reading from lecture notes, and they were like, this means that. But I think it was almost like it was really hard to stay engaged, and you could tell it wasn't authentic. It was just them reading something. You didn't know what was relevant. You didn't know whether they understood it. And I think it's a lot more convincing too when you can put a story in there, because it shows you understanding, from a perspective of someone who's pitching yourself for a job, maybe, or for, to a client. You're trying to sell your service with as a consultant. You're going to need to be able to show an understanding, and sometimes simplifying it with a really interesting example is all you need. And I love that you've used that as an example. I'm definitely going to try this, because I'm still at the very beginning of my ability to present effectively. I'm still scared of doing these events, but I'll definitely work on that. But with regards to that, then what tips could you give someone like me? And I know you've been over a few of them there, but just to abbreviate some tips that you could give someone who needs to work on their ability to pitch their ideas or themselves successfully.
Yeah, I think everyone's different. Some people will actually write out their whole speech. I don't do that. What I do is I come up with an opening that's catchy, right? That'll grab someone's attention. So a question, a quote, a fact, like, hey, raise your hand. Have you ever done this? Or did you know that 20% of students will drop out at this point? Like something that's just going to grab their attention. So the first thing I do before I write a speech is I think about what can I use as my very first line that's going to catch their attention, that's going to hook them in, right? And then I think about what are 3 points now that I can make about that. Like can I drill it down to 3 or 4 points? And then how am I going to end? Like, because for me, the beginning and the ending is the most important thing. How am I going to get their attention? And then how I'm going to leave them with something. So is it a call to action? Like, I hope going forward, you'll do this. Or is it a quote, from Winston Churchill? Like, what am I going to leave them with that they're going to leave feeling something? And then I go back and I fill in the middle. So I figure out that really great intro. I figure out the great ending. And then I think about 3 or 4 points that I'm going to use to support it in the middle. And then from each of those 3 points, where can I find an example? Like, how can I illustrate this point with an analogy, with a story, with whatever? And then I tie it all together, and then I start practicing it. And as I practice it, I'm like, I don't like this, or I like this. And then the other thing is there's a lot of research about how you talk to yourself before you present. So number one, we talk to ourselves more than we talk to anybody else in the world, right? If you think about it, the conversations you have in your head with yourself, you have more conversation with yourself than anyone else. So we internalize those conversations. So they did this study with this group of high jumpers, and they told the first group, no change. Well, actually, they did 3 groups. First group, they said, make no changes, just do whatever you're going to do. And they performed how they always performed. The second group, they said, I want you to think about doing better than last time, like revving yourself up. You're going to do great. And they did better. But the third group, they told them to give themselves very specific directions. You're going to, at this point, you're going to jump, you're going to twist your hips at this point, you're going to do this. When you land, you're going to land this way. And I want you to visualize this very specifically. And I want to talk to you to talk to yourself using your first name. Those people way, way outperform the other group. So the same thing when I go in to speak, I don't say, oh my gosh, Monica, stop being so nervous. You're going to screw this up. I'm like, hey, Monica, and I use my first name. You've got this. You're going to speak calmly. You're going to use pauses. It's going to be interesting. You're going to remember your stories. Like, I pump myself up beforehand using positive words and specific words. So whatever that specific thing I want to work on that day, I put that into my self-talk and I use my first name, because there's a lot of evidence that actually helps us.
Yeah, it's almost like positive affirmation. And I recently spoke to someone who said, don't go into a situation saying, don't be anxious, because what your mind hears is be anxious,
Right.
and
Yeah, it's like the internet. If you type in what you don't want, like if you put in the internet, no dogs, guess what's going to come up? All dogs. All it sees is the word dogs, right?
Yeah.
Your brain does the same thing. You got to tell it what you want, not what you don't want, because it's just going to grab onto the biggest word.
Yeah. And I think that is such a powerful and actionable and insightful way to end this episode. And I'm sad that we have to end this year because there's so much more we could talk about and there's so much more I think I could learn. But just to leave my audience with some actionable ways they can either get in touch or access your book and some other resources, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm pretty easy to find. It's just monicaparkin.ca, Monica with a C, .ca. The book is on Amazon and it's in Amazon UK, both paperback or Kindle. The Audible version is out as well. And then I do have that podcast. It is primarily aimed at women juggling without balls. But yeah, I'm super easy to find. And I love to hear from people. So like send me an email if you have questions. I'd love to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
So, and I just want to say, I think it's awesome that you're an introvert and you're sitting here making a podcast to help others. And that's another thing. When we go into a situation with the mindset that I'm going to do this to help other people, like I'm going to be of service to my community, amazing things just come back from that. Like reciprocity is just amazing. And when you take that leap of faith, not just for yourself, but for other people, really wonderful things come out of that. So good for you for just taking this huge step and creating a podcast and sharing it with others.
Yeah. No, and thank you for saying that. I do appreciate that. So that's it for this week. Thank you to everyone who listened. Thank you for making it this far. It's been a really, really interesting episode. Monica Parkin, thank you so much for coming to speak to me and all the students at King's Business Club and beyond. It's been a pleasure and I cannot wait to implement some of the strategies I learned today. So thank you so much and I'll see you all on the next one.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Have a great day.